in a very static way these categories and so on, and they have led to various problems like the problem of the completeness of the categories and so forth. So, but what I want to argue or show is that underlying this kind of architectonic obsession, there is a rich phenomenology, a rich kind of movement of thought that is at work. And that movement, although it's there in all the three critiques, it comes out most explicitly in the third critique. So that's why I want to kind of bring to light the dynamic aspect of Kant's thinking and also the dynamic aspect of the transcendental ground itself that emerges in the third critique, which is not obvious or remains implicit in the first critique. So that's the main object of this paper. So with that, I'll begin. Um, for Kant, the interrelation between the logical or epistemological sphere and the ethical practical, and thus the possibility of transition from one to the other, is mediated by aesthetic experience. Yet, why such mediation should have an aesthetic character and how aesthesis itself is to be understood remains difficult to fully fathom. To better understand Kant's argument in the third critique and provide some context, one must turn or keep in mind the transcendental dialectic in the first critique. The process of the necessary objectification of rationality in the rules of logic, hence its appearance in positivistic, though still formal objectivities, owing to our spatio-temporal finitude that Kant uncovers in the theoretical or cognitive realm, is also at work in the practical or axiological domain, conditioned by the concept of freedom. Although the transcendental reduction points to aesthesis as a mode of experiencing, along with its a priori forms, space and time, this is irreducible to objective, irreducible to objective representation. Such indication remains oblique in keeping with the temporal discursivity of finite thought within the domain of the cognitive activity of the understanding. The transcendental aesthetical is almost immediately fixed through its categorical representations. Consequently, aesthetic experience proper, qua reflective and not determinative judgment, emerges only via the negation of the always already determinate representations of thought, of the powerful interest of reason towards conceptual determination, whether in its cognitive or practical employment. Aesthetic experience, therefore, becomes synonymous with the properly transcendental, or so I shall argue, the conceptual ground for the genesis of our theoretical and practical concepts. This groundless ground, which Kant attempts to articulate through his notion of the purposiveness without purpose, is constitutive of the unreified movement of reason. Again, something that I will try and argue for. If reflective judgment serves a mediating function between the theoretical and practical realms, it is because it tries to articulate the transcendental as an experiencing, as the ceaseless yet purposive, that is, regulative movement of rational thought below the threshold of objective representation. On the one hand, this move appears to reintroduce experiential, that is, phenomenal content into the formalism of Kant's practical philosophy. On the other, it maintains the negative character of this experiencing in an aesthetic experience of contingency and sublimity, contingency associated with beauty, that is objectified in the unconditional or universal form of the moral law. Kant's notion of aesthetic judgment as the transcendental ground of our theoretical and practical concepts reveals the sense in which his categorical imperative, therefore, is more than an expression of an empty idea of reason and less than its contentful representation. If this is correct, then some account of the experiential emergence of supersensible freedom, a coming to self consciousness of itself as a striving on the part of finite reason, becomes necessary. The third critique provides, sorry, can you just move it to the next? So these are just kind of a few slides which try and anchor this argument in the text. So I'm not going to read it, but this is sort of Kant's statement of the problematic. Right? So in the Critique of Pure Reason, uh, uh, there is the notion of freedom that is introduced, but it's subject to no empirical exhibition. That is the concept of freedom. I am reading it, but I mean you can see it. Okay, so this is the kind of problem that Kant is dealing with. The third critique provides just such an account through the elaboration of aesthetic or reflective judgment or experiencing of the beautiful and the sublime as a purposive striving without any determinate purpose. It is the very form of purposiveness revealed in a judgment of taste concerning the beautiful that opens up the space of reflection or freedom within empirical experience. In contrast, the very violation of form, that is purposiveness, in the reflective and aesthetic experience of the sublime, which is yet capable of indirect sensible representation, arouses in the mind a purposiveness of a different order, namely the striving of reason towards the indeterminate idea of the absolutely unconditioned. Kant's aesthetic philosophy, therefore, enables the transition from the objectified, sensible realm of nature to the objectified, supersensible realm of morality. For it is the non objectified character of aesthetic experience, insofar as such experience is reflective and not determinative, that makes the emergence of the negative yet productive space of freedom, which is the same as reflection, within the experiential field visible. Yet this visibility is of a peculiar kind. It involves, on the one hand, an aesthesis of the contingency of the harmony between the indefinite form of purposiveness of the understanding and the synthetic power of the productive imagination in the experience of beauty, and on the other, of the inadequacy of any sensible presentation to the indefinite idea of reason. Yet an inadequacy which is given through such representation in the experience of sublimity. The division of reflective judgment into the judgments of beauty and sublimity is therefore related to the undecidable oscillation between the relative and the absolute movement of reason, first, for instance, revealed in the antinomies. The beautiful and the sublime are the modes in which this dialectical movement of reason manifests itself when it is not reified either in the absolute idea of a supersensible unconditioned or that of a closed infinity of conditions. Instead, aesthetic experience, qua dynamic unity of the beautiful and the sublime, emerges as the transcendental source of our theoretical and practical determinations, insofar as it constitutes a processive experience of freedom as an infinite rational striving at the heart of phenomenal nature. Further, it is I don't think I'll have time to cover this, but I'll just mention it. It is in a beautiful work of art produced by artistic genius that Kant claims the transcendental attains a certain exemplary manifestation. In such works, beauty and sublimity are exhibited in their irreducible dynamic interplay. So, I should do this from here. Okay. Kant introduces the notion of reflective judgment again in seemingly static fashion by an immediate contrast with determinative judgment. If judgment in general is the faculty of thinking the particular as contained under the universal, then it is determinate when the particular is immediately subsumed under a universal rule or principle. It is reflective when the particular is given and the universal has to be found. This suggests, as in this definition suggests, an absolute separation between the two operations of judgment. However, just as a priori categorially determinate judgments involve a constituted, although implicit moment of reflection, which is then made explicit in the analytic reconstitution, that is, resynthesis of the categories, which involves a modal transformation, as a priori forms of possible experience in the transcendental deduction. Similarly, it seems reasonable to assume that conceptually determinate experience in the empirical realm also requires an inherent underlying reflective operation. As Longinus argues, for Kant, reflective activity is not a separate operation. As Longinus argues, for Kant, reflective activity is not a separate operation standing in contrast to the determinative function of judgment. Rather, it is a necessary complement of determinate judgments, whether transcendental a priori or a posteriori. On her account, as Allison writes, what is distinctive about the third critique is not, quote, the affirmation of a distinct reflective capacity of judgment, but rather the idea that there are judgments, aesthetical and teleological, that are merely reflective. Okay? And Allison, following Longinus, or Longinus rather, cites this passage, right, as proof that there has to be reflection underlying both our determinative and aesthetical judgments as the common root. However, for Allison, this passage is not as decisive as it first appears, since it is explicitly restricted to the transcendental reflective functioning of judgment as it pertains to the schematization of the categories. It does not follow that what holds at the transcendental level should ipso facto hold at the empirical level, where the particular is given and the universal has to be found. End quote. This line of interpretation, which takes the moment of reflection as the implicit common ground of a priori and a posteriori determinative judgments, which the third critique then reveals in its self-standing, merely reflective character, is brought into question by highlighting a problem not sufficiently addressed in the first critique. That is, how are empirical concepts and empirical causal laws that hold between such concepts possible? This problem serves to both situate and provide a point of entry into Kant's argument for a distinct reflective capacity of judgment governed by its own transcendental principle, in relation to a priori reflective or determinative judgments of the understanding. Elaborating on the need for a distinct principle of reflective judgment as it pertains to the empirical domain, Kant explains there is much in nature in respect of its specific empirical laws that the bare a priori conditions of the possibility of nature in general leave underdetermined. Physical objects have an infinite number of natural properties and are determined in an infinite number of causal relations. The general transcendental condition of temporal succession, for example, which is a necessary condition or schema for the possibility of causality and of a causally determined nature, cannot determine the actual causal laws that hold for specific natures. From the perspective of a finite understanding, the infinity of possible empirical causal laws, and thus the unity of nature itself as an interconnected system of such laws, must appear contingent. And yet, not only must such a systematic unity of causal laws be posited a priori as a principle for the possibility of empirical nature and its scientific investigation, but it also attains a certain independent representation in the specific empirically discovered laws of nature. We observe that even in its particular empirical laws, which are, as far as our insight goes, contingent, nature exhibits a tendency towards unity in an interconnected whole. It exhibits the form of purposiveness without any determinate purpose. in conformity with the design or cognitive purposive striving of the understanding towards greater unity and systematicity. It is as if an understanding, though not our own, had constituted these laws for the benefit of our cognition. Yet, since such an understanding cannot be taken to actually exist, the principle of the purposiveness of nature is a regulative principle for the reflection and on and not the determination of nature. Okay. So this is what he writes, hence as if it were a lucky chance favoring our design, etc. Despite pertaining to the empirical realm, the principle of the formal purposiveness of nature is transcendental, since it is concerned with the possibility of the empirical, with the pure concept of objects of possible empirical cognition in general, and thus contains nothing empirical. Consequently, the transcendental status of the principle means that although it must appear in the empirical realm, insofar as nature exhibits a purposive unity in conformity with the transcendental a priori requirements of empirical cognition, it cannot have its origin in the empirical, either in outer or inner experience. Yet, since the empirically cognizable order of nature is underdetermined with respect to the a priori transcendental laws of the understanding, such that the purposive unity of the former is contingent in relation to the latter, the transcendental status of the principles of formal purposiveness pertaining to the empirical realm cannot be derived as a matter of a priori necessity from the transcendental unity of apperception and its transcendental categorical determinations. However, the ineliminable contingency of the fit between the particular and the a priori categories does not, quote, this is from Allison, threaten the results of the transcendental deduction in the first critique. For the latter, sorry, this is a very long thing, you don't have to read it, but and I'm just there, it's just there as a kind of reference. For the latter is concerned with a particular only as subject to the conditions of space-time, and as such, natural objects or events remain fully subject to the categories as determinations of space-time. On these two interrelated counts, the formal purposiveness of nature is a distinct transcendental principle that requires its own separate transcendental deduction. However, the irreducible contingency inherent in the purposive form ascribed to nature implies that the deduction in question can only be subjective and not objective. It aims to establish the subjective necessity of assuming the purposiveness of nature for the possibility of empirical inquiry. The as-if status of subjective purposiveness means that such purposiveness is not determinative of nature in a priori transcendental fashion, for otherwise purposiveness would become the condition of possibility for the very appearance or givenness of nature as such. This is clearly not the case, since not only is it possible to ascribe a mechanistic causality to nature, but nature must appear determined in mechanistic fashion, insofar as it is taken merely as a spatio-temporal unity. The contingency of the fit in question is part of the very meaning of this purposiveness and must also appear in empirical experience. Yet the a priori transcendental status of the principle implies that the postulation of the purposive ordering of nature is not a matter of mere subjective belief. Okay, so now I move to this is kind of creating the space for reflective judgment. Now I move to reflective judgment concerning the beautiful. It is in the experience of beauty, in a reflective judgment, that both these aspects of our experience of empirical nature are brought to light. On the one hand, the transcendental a priori status of the form of purposiveness attributed to nature acquires independent confirmation in judgments of beauty, insofar as natural beauty exhibits an indefinite purposiveness of form quite free from our cognitive or practical interests towards determination or realization of the a priori concepts of the understanding or reason. On the other, it is the independent or free character of this conformity between empirical regularities and the indefinite concept of the understanding, the aesthesis of purposiveness, that shows up the subjective or normative status of the latter. A judgment of taste concerning the beautiful reveals both the harmony or fit between the particular and the a priori categorical unities supplied by the understanding and the contingency of this harmony. Phenomenally, this harmony is given in nature, which appears purposive, whereas subjectively, the harmony is felt in its contingency as the free play of the representative powers. Yet this distinction is blurred insofar as the contingent character of the harmony must also, in some sense, appear in the aesthesis of beauty. The space of reflection opened up in this appearance of contingency within empirical experience. It is opened up in this appearance of contingency within empirical experience. The contingency can appear only insofar as the judgment is reflective, that is, where since no conceptual determination intervenes, we, quote, feel our freedom in the free play of the imagination and the understanding. This feeling or aesthetic awareness of free play is constituted in a distinct mode of pleasure or satisfaction. Kant hints at the close interrelation between the objective and subjective sides of a judgment of beauty. And that's the quote there. I won't read it. This passage anticipates the transition through negativity, that is formlessness, represented in an experience of the sublime, to the supersensible idea of reason, that is the unconditioned. The latter, as objective, though supersensible concept of freedom, underpins, as we know, the practical or moral domain. However, freedom emerges not just through the movement of negation of determinate sensible content, but also in the experience of beauty, in the independent contingent purposiveness that objects exhibit, and in the aesthesis of freedom through reflection engendered in the subject. This indefinite purposiveness on the one hand and the aesthetic satisfaction or disinterested pleasure on the other constitute the positive aesthetic content of freedom, and which is why Kant says, and as was discussed yesterday by Professor Chakraborty, the beauty emerges as a symbol of morality. So I won't go into that because it's very detailed and will take too long. But we can now move to the sublime. Okay, so however, in the experience of the beautiful, in the immediate awareness of this free conformity to the indeterminate purposiveness of nature, just for shorthand, I will use some Husserlian, obviously this is not Kant. So I'm calling this the noetic and noematic interplay. Right? So the noetic and noematic interplay of this contingency, that is the very emergence of the positive aesthetic content of nature, which is otherwise causally determined. So the phenomenal givenness of freedom, in a sense, and its experience. The experience of beauty remains essentially static. There are no, as Kant puts it, violent leaps, as with the experience of the sublime, and its motivating interest towards greater unity is given in sensibility, even if this givenness is indeterminate and can never, so in the sublime, it is indeterminate and can never be adequate to the absolute reason that, absolute unity that reason posits. So in contrast to the static freedom that emerges in the experience of contingency in the midst of phenomenal nature, The experience of the sublime appears to break with all purposiveness and unity of form, and therefore makes the very inadequacy of any sensible given with respect to the positive, unconditioned totality of reason manifest. Thus, the indeterminate purposiveness inherent in the sublime is oriented not by the unity of form, but by the unconditioned, which ultimately becomes reflected as the pure power of self transcendence, that is, as unconditioned freedom. As Kant puts it, in preliminary fashion, oh, sorry, this is. Oops. Yeah. In preliminary fashion, in the context of elaborating the differences between reflective judgments concerning the beautiful and the sublime, uh, maybe I'll read this out. The beautiful in nature is connected with the form of the object, which consists in having definite boundaries. The sublime, on the other hand, is to be found in the formless object, so far as in it or by occasion of it, boundlessness is represented, and yet its totality is also present to thought. Thus, the beautiful seems to be regarded as the presentation of an indefinite concept of the understanding, the sublime as that of the like concept of reason. As you know, the relation between understanding and reason is hierarchical because understanding unites appearances under rules through its synthetic activity, and reason unites those rules under principles, right? So reason is always a kind of self-transcending movement, and that is brought out in the transcendental dialectic in terms of the reificatory movement of reason from the conditioned to its condition, which is then reified either as the totality of conditions or a absolute unconditioned outside this infinite regress of conditions. So the negative force of the sublime, the force by which it appears, quote, as regards its form, to violate purpose in respect of the judgment, to be unsuited to our representative faculty, and to do violence to the imagination, only to be judged all the more sublime, puts reason in motion. Or as Kant writes, the feeling of the sublime brings with it as its characteristic feature a movement of the mind bound up with the judging of the object, while in the case of the beautiful, taste presupposes and maintains the mind in restful contemplation. The sublime admits no sensible representations, since it is always already oriented by the indefinite idea of reason towards the unconditioned supersensible. However, the feeling of the sublime, the negative pleasure arising from the initial violation of sensible or natural purposiveness, and the realization of the inadequacy of all sensible representation with respect to the indeterminate supersensible purposiveness of reason that this violation brings to light, is capable of being sensibly felt. The experience of the sublime is the experience of this moment of negativity, which is yet occasioned and given in sensibility. Right? So that's the quote here. In general, we express ourselves incorrectly if we call any object of nature sublime, although we can quite correctly call many objects of nature beautiful. All we can say is that the object is fit for a presentation that can be found in the mind, for no sensible form can contain the sublime properly so called. This concerns only the ideas of reason, which, although no adequate presentation is possible of them, by this inadequacy, which admits of sensible presentation, are aroused and summoned into the mind. We have here the basis for the transition from the sensible phenomenal realm of nature, determined by the categories, of the understanding in their cognitive employment to the supersensible realm of morality determined by the concept of absolute freedom, uh, reason in its practical employment. Let us recall that for Kant, the immeasurable gulf that opens up between the two realms is due to the two modes of representational closure, the theoretical and the practical, through which they come to be determined. In neither case can the a priori determination, according to these two kinds of concepts, reach the noumenal thing in itself. The latter is a placeholder for the very awareness of the difference between any representation, either in sensible intuition or in the purely ideal or formal, such as the practically fruitful but seemingly experientially empty moral law, and its indeterminate transcendental genetic ground. And it is this awareness of difference, or equivalently representational closure, that is constitutive of the immeasurable gulf between the sensible and the supersensible. The gulf arising from such closure, when reified or taken in an objective instead of a merely regulative sense, sets up the dialectical movement or oscillation of reason between the relative and the absolute. Thus, as Kant shows in the antinomies in the first critique, when reason attempts to determine the unity of nature within the phenomenal realm, it finds itself in a regressive movement where each condition calls for a yet higher condition. Reason thus soon realizes that the relative nature of the relative nature of the relation between conditioned and conditioned, that is the regress, is necessarily infinite. Therefore, according to the antinomies, reason can reify the regressive movement itself qua infinite, or reify the opposite, that is, seek an absolute unconditioned outside sensible nature. In contrast with the thematization of the indeterminate realm of pure aesthetic experience as a transcendental realm proper, reason becomes aesthetically aware of its own purposive movement without immediately reifying it, either the movement itself or the absolutely unconditioned outside this movement as its ultimate telos and final resting place. And this awareness of its own purposiveness without purpose, we have been claiming, constituted in the dynamic unity of the experience of the beautiful and sublime, is constituted, sorry. From the passage quoted above, and keeping Kant's characterization of the dualism between the sensible and the supersensible, that is the phenomenal and the practical, from the second introduction in mind, it becomes clear how this non-reified unity of movement between the beautiful and the sublime enables the transition from the sensible to the supersensible without, however, reducing one to the other. Okay. So this is the broad outline. Now, how much time do you have?
You have 10 minutes.
Okay. I mean, including questions or excluding?
No, excluding.
Okay. So let me just kind of just fill out the sublime a little bit. I'm not going into the architectonics and how Kant goes about, the four moments and each has a deduction and so on. But the mathematically sublime refers to a magnitude that is absolutely great, therefore wholly indeterminate, since it lies beyond all merely comparative, that is relative greatness or smallness. However, it is clear that to determine something as comparatively great or small itself requires a fixed magnitude as a unit against which it can be measured. For if magnitude is determined purely formally by the concept of number, for example, there can never be a first measure, since numbers are relatively determined. Therefore, the comprehension of a fixed magnitude as measure, hence the comprehension or estimation of the comparative magnitude of the objects of nature, is always aesthetical, and thus refers to a subjective standard valid for everyone. It is the imagination that comprehends a measure and thus provides sensible content to the concept of number, which is formally apprehended by reason. Thus, as Kant puts it, quote, although for the mathematical estimation of magnitude there is no maximum, for the power of number extends to infinity, for its aesthetical estimation there is always a maximum. The absolutely great is mathematically apprehended in the formal functional concept of number as an infinite progression or regression, but reason demands the representation of this infinity in a totality. Quote, it desires comprehension in one intuition. End quote. It is this representation of reason as absolute totality to which the comprehension of the imagination remains unequal, since there can be no sensible measure adequate to it. However, in its very inadequacy in supplying an intuitive measure, the imagination becomes aware of its own limits in sensibility, bringing with it the feeling of the sublime in the supersensible. Or as Kant writes, quote, the sublime is that, the mere ability to think which shows a faculty of mind surpassing every standard of sense. Quote, the bare capability of thinking this infinite without contradiction requires in the human mind a capacity itself supersensible. If this feeling of the sublime, the incapacity on the part of the imagination to comprehend the idea of reason, the absolute totality or infinity beyond all representation, and simultaneously the bare capability of rationally conceiving the supersensible, is transformed by reason into a claim for totality, regarded as a real idea, then it comes to be felt as respect for our rational, supersensible destination. The distance between the phenomenal and the supersensible, opened up in the negativity of the sublime, is felt as pain, which is yet also felt as pleasure, insofar as the distance is transformed into an idea of the supersensible represented in reason. As Kant puts it, for the imagination, the supersensible towards which it strives in its attempt at comprehension is transcendent and, quote, like an abyss in which it fears to lose itself. But for the rational idea of the supersensible, it is not transcended, but in conformity with the law to bring about such an effort of the imagination. End quote. The felt inadequacy of the imagination with respect to the rational idea, that is, the non coincidence between imagination as the power to perceive and imagination as the power to conceive, is the source of the subjective purposiveness of this striving towards the unconditioned. Now, the dynamically sublime, on the other hand, concerns the power of nature, which threatens our physical existence. Our powers of physical resistance are revealed as insignificant in the face of the might of nature. And yet, through this very insignificance of our physical being, we discover in our reason a non sensuous standard by which, quote, we can measure ourselves against the almightiness of nature, end quote, and as it were, overcome it. The sublimity in the experience of threatening nature lies in the reflective awareness, which is not of nature, that it occasions, of our irreducible ability to a merely or physical or animal existence, such that nature has no dominion over us. Quote, humanity in our person remains unhumiliated. And we become, end quote, and we become aware of our supersensible destination. In becoming aware of the supersensible in us, we become aware of our freedom from nature, and this feeling for the unconditioned is the moral feeling which we attribute to everyone. Objectively represented as an idea of reason, it is the moral law that commands obedience, hence is merely practically determinative, though intuitively empty. But as Kant puts it, quote, the determinability of the subject by means of this idea, end quote, rests on moral feeling arising from the experience of the sublime. It is this aesthetical dimension which lends content to the empty objectification of the supersensible or unconditioned freedom as moral law. Thus, it serves, though spontaneously, the interests of reason, that is, it reveals a purposiveness towards the realization of the supersensible in the sensible through the very inadequacy of such sensible realization. Quote, the effort and the feeling of the unattainability of the idea by means of the imagination is itself a presentation of the subjective purposiveness of a mind in the employment of the imagination for its supersensible destination. So I'll just wind up now. We see then how the reciprocal interplay of beauty and sublimity instigates the continuous movement of transcendental reason, for beauty manifests in sensibility an indeterminate purposiveness towards ever greater systematicity and unity of phenomenal nature that accords with the interest of reason towards unconditional or absolute determination, while the awareness on the part of reason that the absolute positive totality can never be met with in sensible nature, that the progress within the phenomenal realm towards ever greater unity is necessarily, again to bring in Husserl, an infinite task, is manifested in the sublime through an absolute break with sensibility. For Kant writes, quote, reason desires comprehension in one intuition. However, insofar as this break with sensibility is necessarily transformed into an empty, rational idea, such as the idea of our absolute unconditioned freedom, objectively expressed in the moral law, it again requires a certain intuitive content in order to have any normative claim on us. Right? Formally expressed, this movement amounts to what we have termed the constant oscillation between the conception of relative and absolute difference, or the the phenomenal and the numinal. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Patnaik. The floor is now open for questions. Okay, I'm going to take a couple of younger faces first, and then I will let the professors ask questions. Back there?
Just a small clarification. What is unconditional freedom in Kant, as you were talking about?
Okay, should we take the floor more
Or
just respond? Or?
if you can respond once.
Okay, so I mean, if we are conditioned by nature, right, we are not free. So, our biological status, right, our animal existence, but also our desires and so on, and also any kind of instrumental reasoning, right, what Kant calls the hypothetical imperative, is non-moral, right? Because we are fundamentally, when we are acting according to the hypothetical imperative, we are conditioned by the contingent motive we have, which we give to ourselves, which we then go on to realize, right? So, right, all the way from our kind of instinctual being, all the way to our instrumental being, is part of being conditioned, right? The unconditioned is what generates universality. It's precisely because we are unconditioned that we can be self-legislating, autonomous, universal beings. Right? So that's the element of universality inherent in us.
Further questions?
Yes, I have.
Please.
Hello, good morning, sir. You differentiated between two modes of judgment. On the one hand, like a reflective and determinative mode of judgment, and how it presupposes or is presupposed in experience on the other hand. So why the necessity of differentiating between judgment and experience in the first place?
I mean, these are Kant's differentiation. I'm just trying to, explicate them. But, the idea is that in our everyday kind of world, it's already conceptually determined, whether those concepts are, or that determination is empirical or a priori, right? our everyday world is kind of conceptually determined. It's the world of familiarity, where we instantly recognize things and so on and so forth. So that, and Kant has a kind of elaborate explanation of how that happens in the first critique. But and the Copernican turn and so on tells us that there must be some activity on our part which does the determining, which does the synthesizing in order to produce unified, conceptually determinate experience. But on the other hand, that freedom is, we never feel ourselves as free. The spontaneity is always given after the fact, right? Or it's rather not even given, it's posited as a necessary condition. So Kant is here trying to fill out that claim by giving us some kind of phenomenal ground or experience in which we actually feel our freedom.
Versatile, yeah.
Yeah, so, thank you, Nishad, for this wonderful talk, and on subjects that that you don't usually work on. I don't know, as far as I know. I just thought of a pre-Kantian, kind of development of his philosophy. His influences from Baumgarten, who first, who introduced the term aesthetics, aesthetica in his work. And Kant read that work, but then obviously he could not take that because in Baumgarten it's a remarkable reversal of everything. So he clearly says there's more truth in particular than universal. Of course, he doesn't use the term particular, he says Einzeldinge, so the single object and then species, genus, and goes like that. More abstraction means you are losing out.
Right.
Yeah. So and that's a trend he set. And then in tune with that, there are terms like cognitive sensitivity or sensory cognition, and then aesthetical truths, and even more importantly, in the vagueness, there are more clarity.
Yeah.
So it's the claritas extensiva. It is just opposite to the Cartesian distinct, distinct.
Yeah.
So this is the Baumgarten. Obviously, when Kant hierarchizes in the architectonic of reason in Transcendental aesthetics, he cannot take that all.
Yeah.
But the point is, in the first critique, he was aiming at the finality of Begriff, the term. But when it comes to the third critique, as you clearly point out, that will not work.
Yeah.
So and you have to admit that factum of senses, sensibility, aesthetic, and all those things. But the whole problem with this sublime, which is Erhaben in German, quite close, I would say. This, if I jokingly say, Platonic dimension in all this. Again, I see this problem of lacking finality. In judgment, and also in the judgment of truth, I would say. So that's why, if I take another example of someone, Schiller was so influenced by Kant, but still moving away from Kant and writing this aesthetic education of man. And Dostoevsky was so influenced by Schiller, he was a Schillerian, and finally came to Germany and saw all the sublime human beings and said that no, beauty saves the world, not the sublime. So I'm just giving an example. And a small point also, I really like the way you put nature in all this antinomian thing. To my mind, though Kant says that the antinomian, the Vernunft, the reason, is actually the limit of imagination. Yeah, based on the example that he was saying, the limit of imagining the phenomena aporia.
Okay. Thanks for the comment. And of course, there is a very rich history in the entire debate here, which of course I'm not taken a historical tack, as it were. But the one interesting thing is in trying to think of these things, as I said at the beginning, in terms of their movement and the dynamic element, one breaks with these apparently strict distinctions between imagination, reason, etc., that Kant introduces as part of his very structure of articulation. So, I mean, imagination becomes, and I think that was brought out in yesterday's talk, imagination becomes inherent in, or is constitutive of reason in its power to conceive, right? To go beyond sensibility. And that's part, so, and that is what I'm claiming, or Kant is claiming rather, as I read him, is bringing back some kind of experiential content back into the moral law. It's not a mere commandment from outside. It's not a mere imperative, right? But the whole question of moral motivation and so on is tied to this capacity for us to conceive ourselves as unconditioned, and that's also part of the power of the imagination.
Professor Chakravarti.
Of course, the historical stuff is important. I'm not underestimating it. But I think it will be a good exercise if you initiate and we all participate to take a single example. There was one thing which was a funny thing in your entire presentation, which was, I think, extremely accurate and really on the right notes. You did the explications. But unlike Kant, and a little bit like Heidegger, even Heidegger had his hammer. But unlike Kant, who gives examples at every point, I found that what we need to supplement your talk, if you would kindly do that, is take an example. Now, you said something which struck me as very unintuitive for the normal Kant reader. You said nature itself cannot be sublime. Now, keeping that in mind to justify that, I would urge you to just enact this whole range of things about respect, about the distinction between aesthetic and the beauty and the sublime. Suppose we are facing not an actual tsunami, but in the National Gallery in London, Turner's painting of a shipwreck. Just take that. And even poor Heidegger took the example of the farmer's boots. So just take that example, and whatever you said today, would you just do briefly an analysis of which part, creates the pleasure and therefore displeasure, and which part does not? And as a result, that will be so useful.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking of, including some paintings, and so that would have been nicer. But somehow I thought the time is so short that But in any case, yeah, I mean, I think, and I didn't speak of art as Kant understands it, fine art, that is, where this sublimity and beauty come together, and but this understanding is a very modernist understanding of art, obviously, and even Heidegger is a modernist in this respect. And with the Van Gogh's shoes example, he's trying to show how there's a happening of truth in the work of art, right? It's not just an unconcealment. There's a reflective element which is showing the unconcealment of the unconcealed.
Sorry for bringing up Heidegger. Kant is a handful.
Yeah. No. So I'm trying to say that something similar is happening in Kant, and or at least his understanding of art, and it's the very birth of the modernist conception of art, where art tries to reflectively acknowledge its own conditions of possibility. So you can read various movements.
Who is reflecting?
Huh?
If the art is not reflecting, the viewer is
No. The
reflecting?
artwork itself is a site of reflection. So that's how you get out of the voluntaristic notion of reflection as a turning inward. I mean, this is common to Heidegger. It's there in Kant in this respect. In the aesthetic domain, it's pretty visible. Where he's saying that there is a kind of reflection or space for reflection that emerges from the experience of beauty and sublimity, which cannot be reduced to my voluntaristically kind of withdrawing from the world and so
But
forth.
the
It's out there.
judgment, the reflective judgment, is not in the painting.
No,
It
it
has to be done by the viewer.
Yeah, but the whole point that there is something about the indeterminacy of the painting itself, which is arousing that reflective judgment in you, right? So he's trying to at least locate it in some part of the phenomenal given, of the painting, of the work, and so on. And he thinks that paintings are a kind of the work of genius, what he calls beautiful art, as where nature prescribes the law to genius. Paintings are the site where beauty and sublimity can come together in this dynamic interplay, right? So he says that, of course, when we perceive a painting, much thought is generated, right, without any determinate thought. And therefore, paintings are specific modes of failure of representation. Right? If they're actually latched on in a determinate fashion to some conceptual representation, then of course it would just be a depiction. I mean, it's the creative failure of depiction that is the emergence of reflection from the painting as the site of the processive interplay of the beautiful and the sublime. At least that's how I see.
I think we are beginning to.
I would like to thank the speaker. We have to break off now because we were behind schedule, but we're now not further behind schedule than we were. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Also for keeping to the time. There's now a break.
With that, we conclude the session, and I request everyone to please join for the high tea, which is being served outside.